All right. Our second panel is looking at public violence in South Africa, destabilisation or uprising. And we have 4 speakers on this panel. First, we'll have Awande Buthelezi, and then Roshan, Jainath, and then Crispin, Hemson, and finally Desmond. Each of you has 10 minutes to speak, and then after that we'll have a discussion. Like Awande, I will be keeping strict time. I'll notify you in the chat, each of the speakers, once you have 5 minutes left, and then 2 minutes left and 1 minute left. So please do keep an eye on the chat. And I'm going to hand over then to Awande to kick us off.
Thank you, Jane. I will try to be respectful of time. So I'll begin. I will be talking from the piece co-authored by myself and Prof. Vishwa Satka, A Country Turning on Itself, which looked at the crisis of mass looting which occurred last month. So I'll just jump straight into it. You know, the mass looting was not a sign. I think a lot has been said. A lot has been said since the events of last month began. Even now, as things start to settle down a little bit, there have been a lot of different perspectives. Some people have looked at what occurred as signs of revolution or great social change, but the mass looting was not a sign of revolution. I think anyone who watched what was going on closely was very clear that our society was fracturing, and that's the position that we took on this paper, you know, to say that it was a society turning in on itself. And you know, the way in which our governing party and our leaders have ruled this country has set us on this course for over the past 27 or so years. These fractures within our society were clear for all of us to see, and I don't think anyone was surprised that things could turn in the way that they did, particularly given the situation where we currently are right now within the pandemic. And you could see the signs of this breakdown in leadership, from the AIDS crisis, the AIDS denialism, the high structural unemployment, the persistently high structural unemployment, the widespread corruption, the instability within higher education and education systems. I think the statistic came out recently about 500,000 children since the start of the pandemic dropped out of schools. Those are people who are now being added to these statistics and figures that we speak about. We just celebrated, remembered, commemorated the anniversary, the 9th anniversary of the Marikana massacre. Our state has been dysfunctional to the point where even the president and the ruling party characterizes the past decade as, you know, the 9 wasted years, despite the fact that he was deputy minister during that period. Deputy president during that period, our current president, and an inadequate pandemic response, particularly at the level of the social interventions that the state had to make also. And all of these things we saw during this crisis were then fueled by factional ANC politics, factional divisions, which then threw gasoline onto this fire that our country already found itself within. So these failures, which have been felt very strongly by the African majority in particular, really set the conditions for what we witnessed in the past month. So the question is, moving forward, as a country, are we going to continue to find ourselves in this position of being victimized by our conditions and our leadership? Or are we going to track a new path for ourselves, a post-ANC future, which will give our society some kind of hope, some kind of future, so to speak? So the violence of the past month, just to refresh, began after the imprisonment of President Zuma, with some of his supporters burning trucks on the N3. And obviously this initial beginning of the violence was clearly stated to be in support of the president, the former president, for him to be freed. And the initial responses we saw from our leadership in those early days of this violence, particularly within the province of KZN where it began, the initial response from the premier was to say that, Zuma must be freed. This is, we can see that this has already gone bad. Then the rest of the national and provincial leadership was also a bit quiet on the matter in those first couple of days. Then the violence began to spread to parts of Gauteng, where we then started to see some delayed responses. For example, the president spoke only after 3 days of looting had already begun from KZN into Gauteng. And if some of you were watching that presidential address, there were images juxtaposed of the president speaking while looting was occurring, which was a very jarring thing to experience, but it set things clear about where we were. We began to see inputs from the SACP, the new Zulu King spoke, and then some ministers began to quietly show themselves, particularly the ministers in the security cluster who were stepping over each other to give some kind of answer as to what they'd been doing to try to resolve the crisis or how they'd let this crisis occur to begin with. And then now as the smoke began to settle, we saw other forces within our society trying to stoke racial tensions in the aftermath of this violence within KZN, particularly forces such as the EFF, some PAC remnants, Black First, Land First, and others of that grouping. And there's also something to be said about the death toll, which has continued to rise in the aftermath of this violence. Silently now over 300, but very little has been said as to what those numbers means, those lives that were lost, and those families and people who were affected in such a way. But another thing also was clear in the aftermath of this violence is that there were leaders who stepped forward, local community leaders who reached out to each other across racial and class community divides. These leaders tried very hard to make sure that they could bring some stability, keep people alive, and also show visibly that there is a kind of non-racial leadership or character to our society, which is often overlooked, particularly in the face of such crises. There were leaders; these leaders were there in different provinces in the Gauteng and KZN. They were there at the shops that were destroyed. They were there to clean up. They were there to try bring the community together. They were there to try help with the immediate food shortages. They were there trying to bring these communities back together. And the question is, are these leaders the kind of people in our society who will be supported? And the violence itself, the looting which took place in KZN and Gauteng, as I was saying before, that Zuma did instigate the violence at the beginning, but it's also very clear that it wasn't about him when things reached their apex. So it is very reductive when some parts of the media have spoken about free Zuma protests, or people were just looting for the sake of looting. And it's important that we keep that nuance now that we are in the aftermath of this crisis, because it's very important for us looking forward to understand how we address the cracks in our society and understand the opportunists who were responsible also for stoking these fires. Because the narrative has kind of gone quiet now about the 12 instigators and all of that the security clusters and the presidents were throwing up, trying to misdirect us with regards to who's responsible for this and the role that they played in being ineffective with regards to managing these tensions and these conditions that led to what we saw. And then there's the players themselves. In this article, we characterize them as different kind of monsters or creatures, mythical creatures. Zuma, for example, is the zombie Michael Jackson in the orchestra of ghouls. And he obviously is where we begin, because the conditions for the crisis may be independent of him, but he's where the chaos stems from, because he played his game of saying that, he's ready to bring our society to its knees if he's arrested, and that did take place. And he instigated and led this wave of violence and instability that occurred. But it also quickly, like Pandora's box, once it's out the box, you cannot put it back. It quickly the power was taken away from him. He was not in control once things got fully underway. Ramaphosa, our president, the perfect shapeshifter. He's a parody of Nelson Mandela. He wants to seem like he's someone for everyone, but his government has been very poor and has failed in its response to the pandemic, particularly with regards to the socio-economic mitigation of the effects of the pandemic. Food relief has failed. Social relief grants were dropped. Austerity is crippling our public service. And he works off of the assumption that the private sector is going to swoop in and just save the day, which it's failed to do for the past nearly 3 decades now. And, as this social instability and conflict hangs over us as a society and these governments, it's been in stark contrast to how a large majority of world leaders have come to the understanding to recognize that you cannot effectively govern a society without managing inequalities. As I see that my time is running up, I'll just like to close off by saying on the final player that we have here is capital in South Africa, the vampires who feed off of the economic body of our nation, the wealth divides that we are aware of, for example, how 10% of income earners receive 65% of the wealth and how 10% own 80% of the country's wealth. Big families such as the Oppenheimers, Rupert, and these big players who saw their contributions to the Solidarity Fund as the beginning and end of their responsibility to our society. They also have a role to play in the conditions that led to what we've experienced over the past month. So I'd just like to close off by saying that the racial divides that our country suffers, has experienced and sees since the end of the apartheid era should not be left open to exploitation. I think that has been made even more clear over the past month, and that these conditions also leave us vulnerable to neo-fascists, demagogues, and all these other rogue forces who would seek to exploit these conditions for their own gain, and that there are solutions from the policy front, for example, with regards to UBIG, universal basic income grant, which would have done a lot to mitigate some of the conditions which led to what we've seen over the past month. And the Minister of Social Development has said as much with regards to the need for it. And it's their job now as governments to get this thing going. But the new finance minister's rhetoric leaves a lot to be, it leaves us very concerned with regards to where we're going in that direction. I recognize that I'm over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Awande. We'll move on to Roshan now. Speakers, you're welcome to turn on your cameras if you would like to. But Roshan, over to you.
Hi. Trying to understand what has happened in this period of violence in the month of July, one is forced to actually look at the ANC and understand what has happened in the ANC. And for me, I summarize it very simply without going into too much detail. Within the ANC, it seems to be that white capital is fighting black capital, and they all want to loot in some way or the other. Even if one is more sophisticated than the other, the fight is for who controls the resources of this country. But what is alarming within the ANC is how it's departed from its original mandate, which was to empower communities and empower people. And for me, in dealing with what has happened in Pietermaritzburg, we can sit the entire day and discuss the role of the ANC, the role of the president, or we can actually take what has happened. And in our case, it was an informal settlement that was burnt down by a few vigilantes. And obviously the looting shocked people. It made people scared. And there were a lot of people that mobilized themselves and ensured that they defended their homes and defended the businesses in the area. And I must say that level of organization struck me as something that communities need to do more often, not necessarily in relation to a crisis like we've had, but in terms of organizing a community. Now, the big problem, and I want to use as a case study, Ward 30 of Mzunduzi municipality. And it's one of the more so-called well-developed suburbs among the old Indian communities. And with democracy came a lot of informal settlements. And I think this particular ward has 3 informal settlements within this ward. And obviously, the biggest failure has been a municipality that is firstly totally bankrupt, right? Never mind in administration, they are bankrupt financially, they are bankrupt morally, and they actually have lost the plot in terms of a need to serve people or ratepayers or taxpayers or residents or any developmental needs. They're totally out of touch. And when you have service delivery at that level of incompetence, what is very likely to happen is that even, and I must say that the Ward 30, for example, in the last by-election, the ANC won it, I think since 1994. So it's a progressive grouping of people. But what happens when like a so-called progressive grouping of people suddenly turn and suddenly they seemingly to veer towards the right? And sometimes we need to start to understand what is it that has made people so angry, right? And you know, I often have said, and I've changed my mind in many forms in the last few years, and saying, firstly, the ANC is to blame. And then I changed my mind and say, you know, you need to work with the ANC, or you need to work with whoever the ruling party is. But if one had to be critically aware of what's happening, the truth is capitalism has failed in a way that is alarming in a country where the rich and the poor the divide is so huge that sometimes you are, as an activist, involved in an environment of where change is required and you feel helpless because there's such huge differences, and the incompetence of the government, in this instance I'm referring to the local municipality, is so huge that it actually inflames the problems that exist in this community. So basically what I'm saying is that capitalism has failed. One, the local government has failed to an extent that there's been a vacuum of leadership. And all we have left in Ward 30 is the community. And the community has a choice. The community can go and reorganize itself, redefine itself, in actual fact, find itself again. Or it can allow the outside forces to control it. And if the outside forces control it, in this vacuum of leadership, the truth is a community like Ward 30 is in serious trouble, where there's a threat of violence, a real threat of violence. When the informal settlement was burnt, I had received a call at about 10 o'clock in the night requesting me to come to this place because there was some taxis there and people that I've worked with over the last 3 years. And when I went there were taxi guys actually giving the community guns to say, listen, you need to fight back. You can't allow this to happen. And remember, there was still the smell of the smoke. And not only that, there were vigilantes that came into the camp and literally shot people right in front of them. I'm talking literally a meter away, and shot the one lady. The one 17-year-old schoolboy was shot by a stray bullet a few hours earlier. So it was a very, very angry community. So we needed to respond as a community, because this, for us, we could have been potentially another Phoenix. We could have, many more bad things could have happened if we didn't intervene as a community. I'm not saying as an activist, forget the activists, because this is not about individuals. This is about the will of a community to redefine itself. The first thing we did was to create a peace and development forum. There's a strong argument that without development, there cannot be peace. And so hence we named ourselves the Peace and Development Forum. And for all intents and purposes, when the riots started, this is the time that this organization surfaced. So we did a lot, and we raised close to 400,000 rand, and we're still in the process of raising money. But what we've done is we've rebuilt a major part of the camp. Those houses that were built have now been replaced by much more dignified dwellings. And the next step in terms of this is to actually develop hydroponic gardens. We're putting in some smart toilets. But we want to develop a pilot model for very poor communities without any assistance from the state. And this is in our hands, because if there is an environmental hazard because of so many people living in the center of a formal suburb, then those hazards need to be managed. For example, sanitation, for example, water. And we've made plans even to put a borehole into this particular community. And as I speak now, the borehole has been completed. Now, we've raised money and we're continuing to raise money. But we also seen this as an opportunity not to do government's work. I don't think it should be our mandate to do what government is supposed to be doing. But we're using this as an opportunity to reach out to our communities and to understand, to make our community understand that we're in this together. We have to create a space where we become relevant to the processes that happens in a municipality. Let me give you a simple example. When you have an IDP, the Integrated Development Plan, by law, constitutionally, the municipality should consult with the community. But in actual fact, the community is not organized. So what they do is they have an imbizo and they bring people from informal settlements, and then they basically use that to rubber stamp whatever supply chain has in plan of what they can loot. So the organizing of a community is to reclaim that space, to reclaim the space on what needs to be done for development. Now, none of this can happen if we are not organized. None of this can happen. And as much as it's sad to say this, but this entire issue gave us an opportunity to seriously look to see what the potential dangers are. We became complacent. We don't even know that majority of our population actually go to bed with one meal a day. So many people don't know of the real crises that are happening in the country, including the climate crisis. So we live in darkness almost, or we have created an illusion that everything's okay. And then one day it happens, and then we're unhappy with the president, we're unhappy with this person, we're unhappy with that. The truth is the system has failed us totally, and we have failed ourselves as well. We have failed to organize. Now with Ward 30, we also had a peace dialogue, because when we started building these houses and we started doing this plan, there was like a right-wing backlash in our community. And the guys were really upset. So we decided, we brought in an international mediator by the name of Dr. Mark Manley, and we had a peace dialogue. We started the process. And a lot of people heard what happened in the camp for the first time correctly, because fake news, they were even accusing those people of trying to bomb the cars, and the petrol bomb fell and burnt themselves. I mean, that was the type of fake news that was doing its rounds. But when you see the destitute and the helplessness and how people felt, I promise you it was emotionally charged when you had to sit and just listen to what happened and what people had to go through and what children had to go through at night during this period of this violence. And even when the Indian, so-called Indian community, formal community, spoke about what they go through, and you start to really feel and sense the fear that they feel. And sometimes the lack of knowledge or the lack of correct awareness of what is really happening makes people stupid. It makes them do things that perhaps normally they wouldn't really do. So I'm saying that the peace dialogue itself and the process isn't by any means ended. It's just the first phase that is finished. There's a steering committee formed from every ratepayer organization, every the people that I would think who hate for Africans to be in a former Indian area, who still live in a mindset of the Group Areas Act, they're in this committee. The Africans that want Indians to go back to India, they're in this committee. Because it doesn't make sense to our grouping to say we're going to sit down with the left or with the progressive people and talk to each other, because we are all converted. We actually need to be talking to people who diametrically oppose to us, who actually even resist us. But there's something happening in our community, and I'm not focusing on the violence. I'm focusing on how we can prevent the violence. And the only way I believe we can prevent the violence is to organize our communities. And it has to be at a local ward level, and everybody needs to do it, because it's so difficult in a simple ward. To do this at a provincial level or a regional level or a national level is impossible. Every community has to do it. And we will find ourselves, and we will find what our developmental needs are. A lot of people confuse race with class issues. I mean, if there were a whole lot of small grouping of Indian people living in that informal settlement, and if the majority of people around there were rich African people, the response to that informal settlement might have been the same. This is really a class issue, and we have to ours is now it's a multi-class suburb. It's no longer a middle-class suburb. We have to learn how to deal with it.
Sorry to interrupt.
So
you'd like to wrap up quickly? Or?
Yes. Okay. So what I'm saying is the key for me is organizing communities. The experience that I've shared with you and the experience that we've had in Ward 30 was mobilizing around peace, but more importantly, mobilizing around development. So with that, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Roshan. We're going to move on to our next speaker, Kristen Hansen.
Hi, greetings to everyone, and I'm very pleased that I'm coming in straight after Roshan, because what I'm going to be saying is going to dovetail with some of his points. I'm speaking on behalf of the Active Citizens Movement, but I'm also director of the International Center of Nonviolence, so I will bring in some of that analysis into it. One of the things I think about is why me? Why am I the person who has to go and visit people in prison, who gets constant phone calls saying, I'm hungry, I need this, that, and the other, who has to deal with people I know stabbing other people? Sort of, why do I have to know all of these low-life people? And also the poor people who are not low-life, they just happen to be poor. Well, the answer to that is it's ethnography and autoethnography. I have to keep dealing with these issues, and I get a lot of information. For example, I had somebody in here this morning who was explaining, I was looking at just this morning in Umbumbulu, I was seeing all of these bullets. I think he had 25 boxes of bullets. He was looking at boxes of bullets that had been looted. And from this famous container that was looted at Mabeni, obviously with inside knowledge. And he's been describing to me how people in the area have got so many bullets, they just occasionally just fire them into the air out of excitement. So with regard to the question, insurrection or destabilization, I mean, there's obviously an insurrectionary desire there somewhere, but basically this was destabilization. And I would say primarily using Black people and poor people as vehicles for inflicting economic and social damage. And if what I would extend a little bit on what Roshan's been saying is like the elements of hunger. When I'm very close to people in Lamontville, I'm often there, and a couple of times, people said, just come into my home. I want to show you my fridge. So they've got a fridge. They open the fridge and there is literally nothing inside except perhaps a bottle of water. Hunger is a real element. And one of the lifeguards I know from Lamontville came to see me the other day and was saying, the day after the looting, there was such peace in Lamontville because people had what they wanted. So that there is that element of like, we need, and we've now got. It was short-lived, of course, because the economic situation of the township has deteriorated significantly as a result. And I know that because I have a half share in a business there, which is suddenly struggling. The resentment, deep resentment. at what politicians have done across the board, and the self-interest and the alienation from people who have been successful. And then the existing violence in the area, which has been normalized and treated as just part of the background. It's the violence that comes with corruption. I mean, we've just seen a bus crash in the Eastern Cape, and one wonders, was somebody paid not to provide the right kind of regulatory scrutiny of the buses? Did somebody buy their way into a job? People are very familiar with that. The pandemic of gender-based violence. And there's related to that, there's an epidemic which people are not talking about, that we have amongst the highest levels of violence of killings of young men, in particular, young Black and colored men in the world. And when people speak about gender-based violence, they don't seem to make a connection to that aspect of how violence plays out in the lives of poor communities in particular. But KZN, we have political killings, and then there's the huge problem of drug abuse. I know 2 people who were murdered because of their involvement in this trade just recently. Somebody else I know who's been charged with murder. It turns out he didn't actually commit it, but he cannot talk. He cannot prove that he didn't, because proving it would mean that he'd get killed by the gang involved. So, and then there is the historical trauma of the society. And I don't think we can understand the way that people respond to provocations out of trauma without understanding where that trauma comes from. And it obviously goes back to colonialism, to apartheid. In this province in particular, the political violence, when I read in my student assignments, their family history assignments, the amount of dislocation, deaths, deprivation as a result of the late 80s, early 90s in this province, that political conflict has never been adequately dealt with in the lives of people. And of course, when there is an issue, the South African way is to see violence as the default way of resolving problems. So I think central to what I'm saying is that we live in a society in which Black lives truly do not matter, whatever people say. And the instigators must take some responsibility for what they did, which was to effectively hurl the lives of Black and poor people against security companies, against the police, and so on, with horrible consequences. We really need a lot more information about what was actually happening in the first 3 or 4 days. Phoenix has been spoken about. I was extremely troubled when I heard the details of that, as much as we have had details. But in Le Montfort, people on the evening of the 11th got a voice note to Duduzane Zuma saying, guys, sort of go for it. And people actually in the spa at Mega City just walked out with their trolleys, and the security guards there didn't know what to do. Those people then phoned their friends in Le Montfort, who charged down to Mega City. The access to Mega City is over a narrow pedestrian bridge, very narrow. So in that rush, it seems 12 people were crushed to death. My friend, who was here a quarter of an hour ago, was one of the people rushing to loot. He said that he thought he recognized a face. And on the way back, he was pushing a trolley over the bodies because the place is too narrow. And it turned out to, in fact, have been somebody who had supported him in a local, a difficult family conflict that he was walking over. So that idea of the expendability of Black lives is really a significant element here. of course, the response, and Roshan has been very good in pointing out what the response was, or the range of responses was. My adoptive son, who's black, from Le Montfort, took my car on the Thursday to Musgrave to try and get petrol, and was stopped at a barricade. It was like really interesting. He came just the other day. Oh, I forgot to tell you what happened that day. So I said, what happened? He said, there was a couple of white guys and there's some Muslims. And then I put down the window and I said to them, where can I get petrol? And they said, oh, just go through here and then go down that road and you'll find a place there. It was like really interesting. Now, you know, the issue of racism comes up. Maybe they had all kind of racist responses to him. Doesn't matter, because actually they treated him very sanely and reasonably. And we ourselves, the household, went down to find another member of the household at South Beach. We were stopped at a barricade. It had primarily black, as it happened, but they said, we're not allowing cars in because we don't want looting, so please stop here. It was actually fine. It had nothing to do with race. So it was very troubling that in some areas this was so highly racialized, and Roshan has pointed out some of those elements. ACM was getting reports on places like the Bluff, white guys who'd been in the South African Defense Force, acting in a highly racist way, and using their military training in that way. Just to move to be a little bit more analytical, I think the real economic costs of the violence are much clearer, and the real environmental costs. The fact that we've had this UPL factory at Cornubia, it's not just that it was burnt, which is obviously very, very damaging and criminal, but it was revealed, this revealed the complete lack of regulation when approval was given to that company to be established there. The whole process has actually, whatever the instigators planned, in reality, it has intensified inequality. It has also led to a mistrust of political parties, which creates a kind of a gap. Early in the process, it struck me that, you know, I was looking at the looters. I mean, the looters were not particularly around here, were not very hostile to anyone. They were very, very focused on these things they were getting. And, you know, so instead of, I was on radio a couple of times, and I realized the anchors were locked into a kind of, there are these bad people out there and we are good people. And that is not an effective analysis of what was going on. The looters, I mean, some of the looters coming back into Le Montfort were met with guys with guns who took all of their stuff off them. So they'd done the hard work of looting. And we have to open up dialogue processes. So this is actually our role as ICON, that we are we are initiating a course that is, by the way, Roshan, actually, we've asked Anthony Walton in Warthausen and Maritzburg to link with us on this, to train facilitators, because they need training in this kind of work. And we're also looking at what are the patterns of leadership that we are witnessing and why are they so damaging. And I'm sure it must be close to my time, but just to make a point about left-wing people here, because I'm in discussion with my brother, who's a well-known Marxist, currently trapped in the United States when he'd like to be living here. But I do sense a kind of disconnect between the structural analysis and what might be called a psychological analysis that I've been following to a large extent. But we have to see how people's sense of themselves, who they are, what we aspire to, is actually part of the economic structure, is informed by the economic structure, informs the economic structure, that our emotions are not a private matter, they are political. Our responses are both political and personal, and we have to break through that way of looking at things in a very political way only, and quite separately in a kind of personal psychological way. I mean, in the end, for me, the economic and the environmental issues have to come together, as was said, early on by Natalia, that these things, we are connected to all of this. We cannot rely on creating these dichotomies and binaries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crispin. And then over to our last speaker, Desmond.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Hi, Des.
Yeah, thanks to go after Crispin. I don't need to do my presentation on the environmental on UPL. Look, I think if a lot of people have the assumption that this started yesterday. And I think there's been warnings over the years about the system is collapsing all over the world. And despite that, people continued on the road to continue to prop up the system that was creating the biggest inequality in the world. And South Africa's different. Yeah, I live in a community, Crispin, where there's plenty of guns and drugs. And those million bullets and guns are floating all over the area, and a lot of people have died. Especially the young people are being killed off in the area I come from. To the issue of the failure of the government, which some of you have alluded to, Cyril Ramaphosa was absent completely. The ministers that were absent completely, security ministers were never in sight. But more critically, yeah, is that our provincial premier was absent for some time, only came out on national TV to talk to people. They were never on the ground. The mayor of Durban was gone missing, he was AWOL. So we had the most senior politicians that never came out to speak about it and to speak to the people and give people assurances, not only of their safety, but also what can they do about it. What's more critical, yeah, is that the whole grant was removal. The 350 was taken away from people at a time when COVID-19 was severe and people were hungry. Huge unemployment. We lost 7 million people unemployed in this country during 2020. So government has abandoned the people. And so they need to look at themselves. It's time that the government must start looking inward. Yes, Jacob Zuma has been responsible for a lot of the whole notion that he needs to be free, and that the looting that he started long before him continued even afterwards. That looting is a just reward, and that nobody should be prosecuted for it. Now, to the issue of the violence that happened, a lot of people have got the wrong notions that racism. I belong to the coalition of the poor in Durban, which is the shack dwellers, hostel dwellers, the fisher folks, the subsistence farmers, the market users, the market traders. This is a multitude of integrated, of all races, all creeds, all religious, all kinds of people that work together. You cannot blame the entire population and say people are racist, and therefore this was created by racism and people were killed because of racism. The subject of racism has come up so many times and it's been swept under the carpet. The Human Rights Commission must hang their head in shame that this continues to come up under their watch, and they've done nothing all these years. Since 1994, racism from all corners of the earth have been there, and they've sat back and done nothing to deal with this problem. The second thing is that inequality is growing. And the Chapter 9 institutions have done nothing about this inequality. They've sat back and allowed the government to continue to trample over people's rights. Not only our security forces are responsible for the shooting and the killing, and the army have been responsible for it. They're all involved in it, together with our government. Marikana was one example, but there's been so many other examples of the trampling of people's rights to have dignity. The other very crucial point here is that this came at a time when the government was at this, when looting of the COVID-19 funds, 500 billion. And the police did not get their increases or any other of the other civil servants, whether it's the doctors or nurses. And what we found is that a lot of people just stopped working. The police didn't work at all. So citizens were left on their own, and they had to protect their homes and all that there, because the police, the people that we employ and pay lots of money, were never around. They only came out after days after the looting. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that the police and the military are involved in part of the looting. Let's not forget that. There's videos going around showing policemen in KZN, the Metro Police and SAPS, huge amount of stolen stuff. We were driving around the area all over to try and look at the chemical industry, because we were living in, if one of those chemical industries blew up, like what happened at UPL or the Buthelezi chemical storage facilities on South Coast Road, if some of those highly toxic chemical industry blew up in South Durban, thousands of people would have died. So thank goodness the community had to shield themselves and stand up. But the main critical point is that government allows these developments near people, but they are nowhere inside. Nowhere inside to provide safety and to ensure that these facilities are operating in a manner that is safe and sound. In the UPL incident, I've been there every single day since the explosion and fire. And there's serious questions being asked: how did a facility of this nature be developed right next door to people, to informal settlements, to people all over the show? How a facility of this nature was put near a river and estuarine, and contaminated all the food and contaminated all the water and killed tons of fish. So there's a lot of questions around this whole episode that took place. Was it well planned? Yes, the Zuma radical transformation, people use the masses of our poor people to agitate and to fight for whatever was there. What about those groups? They've not been touched, none of them. This was well planned. If you look at the type of industries that they took on, that they looted or blew up and left others, it tells you that this was planned. And the masses of our people only went for food because they were hungry. But they're not being arrested. Why? Why is the people that are well known, that are high up in the ANC and the political party, are not being arrested? Something's not right here. Something's not right in that there's an increased securitization and innocent people get killed. How's it that when the majority of poor people, the coalition has been marching in Durban all these years, hundreds of people, we get blown up, there's water cannons, we get arrested, we get locked up in jail being innocent. And yet, yeah, clearly there are people high up in government, officials that were high up in the council that were involved, but none of them have been arrested for this whole thing. How is it that you want to arrest innocent people and go after them and take back the food, when you know fully well that the people that have been looting are still enjoying their freedom outside? They stole millions out of the council coffers in Durban, millions, including some of our ex-mayors and municipal managers, but they're walking around freely. So one has to, and I agree with Roshan, it's a class issue. The rich, there's no law for the rich. Only the law is here for the poor. We can go after poor people because they are easy and soft targets. We can go after poor people because they've got so many challenges that they face daily. Unlike the rich who can just go and build up and live in massive mansions and all that. If you look at the Mhlanga Rocks, only UPL was damaged. But if you look at all the shopping complexes, the beaches, and the houses right near, nothing was touched. So when people talk about Phoenix, one must realize that some of it was deliberately stirred up to create a racial war. And that investigation still must go through. So we can check and find out who are these people that are involved. I also want to say this, that to get to the bottom of this conversation mustn't end today. We must have regular conversations in the community so that we can force the change, we can bring about and dismantle racism and xenophobia. This continues to rear its head every time. And then everybody's gone quiet after a while. They go to the sexy subjects the next time. And this is the problem, is that we never deal with these problems holistically and implement a proper program so that we can develop coexistence. We can break the inequality that's there and the poverty, and we can bring about change to create one country, one community. We will not reach there unless we are prepared to take the plunge and start talking more openly about this and not afraid to speak about it. It can't be just a research paper. And it can't be just a discussion for now. It's a discussion that should take place everywhere, all the time, until we reach our goal. And if we don't put that effort in, we ain't going to break the races, and people will use it. Continue to use the masses of poor people against one another. We end up killing one another because, and the rich are smiling and laughing at us because they're far away from it. They've got all the security forces protecting them. Time for change, and the change that will help us is that we must go down, fold up our sleeves, and work together with those affected the most, those that are living in inhumane conditions, those that don't have access to water, those that don't have food. Their children go to bed hungry. Those are the ones we need to work together with and build a new society. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Desmond, and thanks to all the other speakers on this panel. I see that Desmond has to leave quite soon. So we would appreciate any questions to Desmond. If anyone has those, to please raise them now. Desmond, if you're still with us, what time do you have to leave? Sorry, just on mute.
I'll give you 10 minutes, guys. 10 minutes,
10 minutes.
and I'll leave.
Okay. So if anyone does have any questions to Desmond, please do raise them, but we are going to open up for discussion now. If you have any questions or comments, please raise your hand. I see there's a question here to Des from Vish. What happened in Clare Estate? Desmond, if you just want to touch on that.
Yeah, sure. Clare Estate is a mixed community, but what has happened is that a lot of the shops were also looted. You know, we had a problem last night with two of the factories in Clarewood. Clarewood is predominantly one of the oldest Indian community in Durban, and it employs. There's over 5,000 informal settlements in Clarewood, all employed in Clarewood. They walk to work, their children school in Clarewood. So something must have triggered it where two of the companies were burnt last night, and we're still investigating to get to the bottom of it. But there's a good relationship with the Indian communities in Clarewood. The markets are all there, all the early morning market, the wholesalers, all the factories where people sew. Those small little factories, the clothing factories are all in Clarewood. It is the biggest employer, far bigger than all those shopping malls. So these communities, what we call the small economic zones, are long-time shopping complexes owned by individual families, good relationship, and we don't know what is stirring up there. There's no racial tension in Clarewood. I work there a lot in Clarewood, and I know that the people in Clarewood wish there's no racial tension, but there could be elements that really have their own personal things that could happen there. We know that the ANC councillors cannot appear, cannot come to the area. He's had his own personal fight with the ANC branch. We don't know if that's also leading up to all the tension that could be there. But certainly, I think that is a problem that can be resolved by us.
Thanks, Desmond. And then there's another question here from Vish. What role is the Alliance of the Poor playing now?
Okay, so a lot of the Coalition of the Poor has been talking. We're going to Phoenix. We've had meetings there. We've been talking with the Phoenix Residents Association. We've been talking to the Bombay community. So a lot of the work has been done together with the, I must tell, within the coalition. Abatladi, Basam, John Dolo, the Shack Dwellers movement has been there. The Hostel Dwellers movement has been there. We have been preaching unity and peace, and we've been going to those communities and talking to people. And that brought about a bit of change, a lot of it. And we've been supporting the areas where people have really been having real problems around food and food security. That's been an initiative both from the Coalition of the Poor, but within the South there with everything, because we understand people just couldn't buy food. You couldn't even buy a loaf of bread. You can imagine for days people couldn't buy bread. So people were providing, to make your own bread, meal, flour, and all those sort of things. So people have reached out, and the tension, the calmness has gone down. There are areas where there has been, we heard Roshan and others talk about Duduzuma Zuma. We know in some of the areas where he's married and lives there, he did start up something. One of the areas was Nandi Drive in Newlands East, where all the big warehouses were. And those warehouses were gutted because Zuma lives in Newlands just a stone throw away. And a lot of people came out in their numbers. Might I say, they blamed the poor, but the poor only took food. When it came to those massive TVs and all that, there was the rich and big cars, huge amount of vehicles, the expensive vehicles, carrying away all and looting. So not all is the poor. The poor, yes, for the food, but they didn't steal all those massive TVs that cost a lot of money and all those fridges and stoves. So we are working in the area. We are talking to people. In some of the areas, where the ANC has managed to get in, they stirred up some of the nonsense. So there's some political connotation, as Roshan and others have said here, the different factions within the ANC have caused some of the problem. And we need to establish the facts around this issue. I've been speaking to ANC guys in the province. Some of them are very disappointed. And it's just that they can't talk up. And like Cyril Ramaphosa hasn't spoken up. It seemed to be the same thing in the province as well, that they didn't speak up when they were supposed to speak up at all. And we saw that with the Premier when people were calling out, where's the Premier to come there? Where's the police to come there and deal with the problem? They didn't. And then the whole focus was changed to Phoenix. I'm afraid you cannot make Phoenix the major issue, because how many people were involved in all this? It wasn't 90% of the people in Phoenix involved in it. At least 10%, I would say. But the 90% of the people have been living for generations with people there and have got on with people. Some of them are masses of poor people. Phoenix is not all rich and thing. There's a lot of poor people that live in Phoenix. So I would give it that there that we need more work to be done. We need to get out there and really do some good work with people and achieve small blocks where we can get people to work together and live together. I think now is not the time to divide the people and blame which side. I think is how do we bring people together? And that's what we've been doing in Phoenix. That's what we've been doing in Merebank. That's what we've been doing in the hostels and all the informal settlements, of working together and bringing people out and putting out statements that says, we disagree with that. We agree with unity. We agree that the government must do something. And I think we're going to show that there in our programs that we are going to get out there, so that people need to know the power they have, what they can do about the situation.
Thank you, Desmond. I think we'll take 2 more questions and then we'll allow you to respond first, Desmond, and then you can go and then I'll open it for the other speakers. So firstly, Natalia says, how can you sustain the work of the Peace Committee into the future? And then Vish says, the Solidarity Fund committed 400 million to food aid in KZN. What's happening in this regard? Des, you can go first.
Yeah, I can. Let me just say, we haven't seen it, eh? We haven't seen that 400 million. It's come to no one. We don't know who it's gone to. And whatever's been done has been done by community people themselves and organizations themselves to feed the poor. So I'm yet to see any of that money, like the COVID money. I'm yet to see this money as well. And I think we need to ask some serious questions around the money. Where's it gone to? Because that will be critical. And once again, the poor, the masses of poor people have been shortchanged. And I think, as Roshan said, we need to build communities together rather than allowing government and waiting for government. I think the time is that we start doing things ourselves and forget about the whole notion that we have a government that cares about anyone.
Okay, it looks like Desmond has left us. Roshan or Crispin, would you like to respond?
Yes. I think the question around how to sustain the peace committees is a critical one, because it talks to sustaining the level of organization that has been intense over the last month. Now, I think the first point is inclusivity. And again, I'm going to stress that we can't talk to ourselves. We have to bring in people that have very, very diverse views. Now, what we've done with we've got like a peace secretariat and a development secretariat. One grouping is looking at the development of the camps, and we're going to be looking into the other camps as well. But with the peace, we actually have the mediator that chairs that, because it's the mediator that's going to draw in the other people. But what was also interesting is we had a meeting with the Human Rights Commission last week. Sorry, in the beginning of this week, on Monday, actually. And what was critical is that they had taken our municipality to court on the issue of our dump site, and it was really a hazard. It is a time bomb waiting to happen, right? So they took them to court, and they now holding them to certain reports every month. And if the municipality fails to do that, do what it's supposed to do in that month, they could be held in contempt of court. So when we approached them, what our critical question was, can you intervene for us as a peace committee with the municipality on other issues, including developmental issues? And they said, yes, it is within the mandate. And that is very much cheaper than to go to court. So we've now gone into the next step where the Human Rights Commission is going to mediate between the peace committee, a peace and development committee, and the municipality. So we're taking practical steps to get our community involved and for this to be sustainable. Because service delivery is a sustainable thing. It will go way beyond these issues and threats to violence. But not serving people and not giving people the opportunity to have food, not giving people the opportunity for a basic income grant, that is also violence. It's a violence in a different way. And to engage with the local authorities through Chapter 9 organizations may be a critical step. So I just wanted to share that because we are really seriously asking the questions. How does the peace committee become more sustainable with a long-term view? Obviously, we want to register an NPO shortly as well. So the other question regarding the Solidarity Fund, to be honest, we haven't heard anything about it. And even if it's coming through, it's not something that is known in our circles of where community activism is very strong. So that's very unfortunate. Thanks.
Thank you, Roshan. Crispin, would you like to add?
Yeah, just, I mean, I would have heard of the Solidarity Fund, had started actually getting food out to people because I do know what's happening on a day-to-day basis in the one township in particular. Nothing so far. I will ask people to ask, but I also think that maybe it's one area that we could be mobilizing people about and saying, do you know that there's a solidarity fund? Let's try and get food from them, because there really is a serious need for food. And of course, for a lot of people, there are additional costs now because shops have been destroyed for reasons that are not always clear. So the guy who came to see me this morning is from Umbumbulu. The local Boxer supermarket was not only looted, but burnt out, which is very different, because the Boxer supermarket is a franchise, as I understand it, and it's a local black business person who's lost that business. That also then imposes all kinds of costs on local people. I mean, as it happens, he's one of the few beneficiaries because his job is to clean it out and to repaint it. But yeah, those are the kind of things that are working their ways through the system. And I think people are feeling both that the level of trauma in the society here is still very, very high. When you just the idea of going into a shopping center and realizing that 50% of the businesses are still not operating, there's still broken windows, it communicates something very very unsettling. You may not like these businesses or use them, you know, but just the fact that they're not there suddenly is disturbing. And I think we are people are in an unhappy state. ICON is our role as ICON is not directly in relation to peace committees. We see our role as research, which actually had already been planned around some of these issues before the unrest. Research and teaching, you know, development of people as facilitators. We have a leadership program. We've been asked to run these programs now in 6 different areas of the metro. But just to give, there are some really good stories emerging out of this. One of them is that a young woman we worked with who has not been a DUT student, but was on our leadership program, set up her own dialogue process within Intuzuma. And that, I mean, that process, and she's inexperienced, she's young, she's inexperienced, but she involved SAPS, she involved the Community Policing Forum, and the meeting itself was highly significant. One thing is that police began to talk about what they experienced. One of the officers actually burst into tears and said, "Oh, you don't know how insecure I feel." So you see how that people have been pitted against each other. At some point, the police had to withdraw from the meeting because the members of the Community Policing Forum began talking about their experiences, which included looting. And so the police said, well, we better not listen to this, otherwise we'd have to take some sort of action. But the degree of social alienation, of being cut off from the centers of power, being left to fend for ourselves, I mean, thrown back onto own resources, which some people managed in a remarkably positive way, and others really reacted to very aggressively. You know, those are the issues that we have to address as a society. And now I think that what is coming through clearly is that civil society will have to take this task on. And maybe government will follow, but we have very little faith at the moment in that.
Thank you, Crispin. I see there's another question, but before I take that, Awande, do you have anything to add?
I would just a brief input with regards to the long-term trajectory in which this is played out. Is quite concerning, particularly with regards to some of the questions that have already been asked with regards to how communities are handling things on the ground, the role of the Solidarity Fund, and things of that nature. Is that the information is now moved from being in the forefront of the state's role in this, how they're intervening, and the way in which they're addressing some of the causes of this, has now kind of somehow moved towards the back. I think when we saw the cabinet reshuffle occur, there was an element of that which we could point to as being in line with this, and somehow some would even say perhaps even as a response to this. But it is quite concerning moving forward with regards to how little is being said from the state side in terms of the on mainstream media and openly about their medium, long-term perspectives, goals, and objectives in dealing with and addressing this crisis.
Thanks, Awande. And then we've got another question here, too. So the factional struggles in the ANC are clearly implicated in violence as a political formation. It threatens everything. We cannot be trapped by it. How do we think and act beyond the ANC to secure a future for the country and communities? That's from Bish. And then also the peace processes are amazing. The dialogues are crucial, but what happened in July speaks to the crisis of the democracy and the nation building project. What role should the state play to address what has happened during July? Would anyone like to respond to that first?
Okay, can I respond to the first question? With regards to the factional battles in the ANC, I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I'm going to say that organizing our communities is going to become a critical feature of holding government to account and holding the ANC to account. Because clearly the ANC, with the centralized democratization model, has always worked from top to bottom. They have no respect for bottom up. Whatever is written in the constitution is easily manipulated by them, and they don't respect bottom up. So bottom up is something that is our responsibility, and we can hold people to account if we are highly organized. And I know it sounds like it is a very, very important factor in coming to grips with what happened. And the only thing that makes me happy, really happy, is that this July incident gave us a full perspective of how inept the ANC is, how responsible it is for the factionalism, and the fact that it's a quest for power. It needs to keep certain people out of jail. But even though one side of the factions took on the other side were also clueless. And how they responded is telling about our real crisis. I'm going to argue that we've actually allowed this crisis as well. And I'm saying that we cannot simply place it only at the door of political parties or certain groupings, etc. We have to really say that as communities, I mean, from the time that the UDF was disbanded, it was the first organization that had some semblance to a bottom-up structure. Now I'm saying we need to do more about organizing ourselves and about understanding the importance of a bottom-up structure, community structures, to hold people to account. And that's the only way you're going to dismantle the ANC. The only way you're going to dismantle a government that doesn't care. And it could be any government, because remember, all these capitalist parties are going to, one might be a little bit more sophisticated than the other, but there's no respect for poor, there's no respect for people at the lowest form of the supply chain or the food chain. So organization for me of these communities is critical. So I think I'd allow others to have a say on this as well.
Thank you, Roshan. Crispin, would you like to add?
Yeah, look, you're talking to one of the few beneficiaries of the whole process, in the sense that DUT, like ICON, International Center of Nonviolence, because we've got so many doctoral graduates and they make money out of the doctoral graduates, but suddenly they discovered nonviolence is in short supply, and we've got it here at DUT. So suddenly we're treated with immense respect within the institution, which is really a little bit strange. But I do think that there's a gap that has opened up, and we should be thinking about what the nature of that gap is and how we move proactively to secure real advances. I mean, maybe the pressure will come off and this gets relegated to the back again. But unlike other outbursts of violence, like the xenophobic violence a few years ago, there's a genuine sense of disquiet that extends beyond the groups on the receiving end of the violence. And there's much more openness to hear of alternative ways in which we think about these problems. And to be, when it comes to the role of the state, I mean, one of our demands should simply be that the state should act as the state, and not as a kind of political actor that is there to advance its own its particular interests. We need, for example, the state to support dialogue processes in communities. We should be looking at the forms of regulation that actually protect people, and not and we should block any attempts to undermine regulations for the sake of pursuing after some sort of false economic gold mine, as is so obviously now revealed the case at UPL. Interesting to see that the Isimangaliso Wetland Park was about to host an economic summit. The great business opportunities that you could get in the wetland park, they've postponed that indefinitely. I think because suddenly there's a realization that at some point the cost of this approach to trying to commercialize everything, to make a fast buck out of everything, is starting to look suspect. And those are the kind of issues where I think we have the chances of getting across class lines, in particular, some degree of unity. Now, in Roshan's case, the Msuduzi municipality has got a coherent grouping ready to take on the municipal elections, as I understand it. I really hope that that works. Well, we don't at the moment in the eThekwini Metro. So, yeah, those are the kind of opportunities that we should be seeing, but we should be working also within the elements within the state, elements within the ANC that can understand the damage done and have some degree of commitment to democratic processes. Thanks.
Thank you, Crispin. Awande, would you like to add?
I'd actually like to respond to a point that I'm seeing from Charles in the chat with regards to social media's instrumental role in all of this. And I think that to a degree there is, I think there's been a big focus on it, but I also think that at a point it can distract from what's been happening on the ground, some of the relationships that people have with members of their community and neighboring communities. And I just think that we shouldn't get too lost in that aspect of things, particularly when we're thinking around the regenerative projects and building back these communities stronger and more resilient, because there's no substitution for those real life interactions and links. So I think that there has been a lot of focus on that, but just to say that we mustn't get too lost in some of those things also.
Thanks, Awande. And then I see Natalia would like to speak. Go for it, Natalia.
Yeah, thanks. So my first point is that I agree with Roshan. The ANC has really taken its the electorate for granted. And would it be worthwhile considering a possibility that where local communities are strong and organized, that they consider fielding independent candidates? That's the one thing that would just sort of perhaps worry the ANC and make them perhaps a bit more responsive to their electorate. And also, if we have a candidate that's from the community, that might also be better. But I also am quite aware of the violence related issues, especially in KZN. The second point is I've been struck by the lack of power and functioning or dysfunction of many of the regulatory authorities in South Africa. You know, and I think that's been part of the hollowing out of state institutions. So whereas SAPRA, for example, cannot manage the ivermectin issue, or the MRC can't do that, the environmental health people and cannot have failed to hold the UPS and the big chemicals fire, failed to hold the correct people to account. In mining, for example, the effects on health, you know, there's the children in Snake Park being affected by the mine tailings. Again, these regulatory institutions and authorities are completely useless. And maybe, you know, we should also look at trying to unhollow them out and trying to make them more responsive and more capacitated, and bring them on side so we can use them for our own good. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalia. So I think this will be the last round of questions. If anyone else would like to raise a final question before I get all the speakers to respond or write it in the chat, please do so quickly. I'm also just going to read Charles's question again, if anyone else would like to respond to that. So social media was instrumental in spreading fake news, racial content, and a whole lot of toxicity, and media houses reiterated the lies. Should we not start thinking about tougher regulation? Is it still freedom of speech or freedom of capital turning toxic content into profits? And then Vish has a question here. How do we ensure SAPS prosecutes the instigators? Okay, so we've got Natalia's comments, and then the one about social media, and the one about SAPS. Roshan, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I think it's always going to be an option for somebody to consider taking.
Roshan, are you there?
Yes. Am I off? Hello?
Quite soft.
Okay, let me just try this again. Okay, can you hear me now?
It's a little bit better.
Right. Hello, can you hear me now?
Shout.
Yeah, for some reason it is very soft, so
Okay. Can you see this? It's on full volume.
I'm not sure what's happened. I don't know if it's just me.
All right, can you hear me now?
That's a bit better. Okay, go for it.
The question of whether one feels a candidate, you know, it's a very interesting question, and I suppose there are merits on both sides of the coin. When one enters the politics of power, somehow things start to get a bit blurry at times, and the activism and the groundwork that is done somehow speaks to more a selfless mode of operation. And sometimes one has to find the balance between this. And I say that the balance is possible, but it needs to be clearly thought out, right? So the Peace Forum, for example, is more committed to facilitation as opposed to being an active participant. We don't want to be in politics. We don't want to be seen. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right. We don't want to be seen to be siding with political parties. Now, we understand we are in a political space, so we can't say we are apolitical, but definitely we want to try and be non-party political. And there's merit in what we are doing for this time, place, and context, because we are trying to rebuild a community and we're trying to build peace. So I don't think we can do that now. Maybe at a later stage, it might be something that the committee would want to consider. The next point that I want to respond to is regarding social media. And that's one thing to have people going crazy on social media, but very often when something is said on social media, what I would look for to see if News 24 or one of the other more credible media houses will verify that. And if I do see Media 24 saying this has actually happened, it sort of validates that. So often you find that the media, especially Iqbal Sweb's media, who seems to be totally aligned to Jacob Zuma, tend to speak a lot of untruths. In fact, they promote fake news, and that brings about the question of whether the media should be regulated. Now, I hear a lot about whether media should be the freedom of expression as such, right? And that's important in any democracy. One would argue it's the cornerstone of our constitution. But I mean, should you be so free that you are free to lie? And I think, again, it comes down to a balance. Media reporting on the truth is very important. And I suppose we have trusted the media to have a form of self-regulation for a long time, but they continuously let themselves down. So at some stage, without the state getting involved, because I don't trust the state to say they're going to regulate the media. But again, coming back to community-based bodies and some other forum, but that's more non-aligned to a state as such. And whether this is possible or not, I am not sure. But I'm still of the argument that some form of regulation is actually necessary. Yeah.
Thank you, Roshan. Thanks. Crispin, would you like to add final comments?
Yeah, I don't know. I could actually just share my screen and on the social media side, and what the discussion about social media is, I think, really important, because I was watching on Facebook some of the stuff on Facebook, and I was appalled, and it seemed to be quietly feeding. Not always directly, quietly feeding into some very dangerous things that did actually happen. But what I'm sharing with you is what this young woman posted. I mean, she put our name into it without asking us, but we really didn't mind because she was using social media. And this is an young unemployed environmental activist in Tuzuma who launched this. So perhaps we need to build into, for example, the training work we do around nonviolence, how most effectively to use social media and to and also how to report dangerous and offensive material on social media. Yeah, I think that's what I'm going to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Crispin. And then Awande, any final comments?
I think I'd just like to close off by saying on this point that the social media question, I support and agree with regards to the need for regulation, particularly around the question of freedom of speech. I think is allowed to be a loose one, which often allows people to abuse it in the way in which we have seen in the wake of all of this unrest. But that also saying that that I think that there's also spaces in which we can allow those tools to serve as an indication for where things are right now, the kind of rhetoric which is on the ground, and also the kind of potential for the kind of things that we've seen over the past month or so, because I think it goes without saying that these things do not stem out of nowhere. These conversations and these instigators and this kind of rhetoric has been fermenting and has been allowed to occur for a while now. So I think it's about time that it's used proactively to help us stamp down and kind of shut these things down and nip them in the bud where they are. And I'd just also like to say that in closing, that also the situation has given us an opportunity, as not just as a society, I'm not speaking from the level of the state, but as civil society actors, as communities, to also take some of this responsibility into our own hands. I think that the example of the speakers is an indication of that, of what active citizenry looks like, and the kind of potential that we have in our society to solve some of these issues without the state. It's unfortunate, though, that the institutions, resources, and capabilities of the states have implications that go to a national scale. But there is hope in the way in which a large number of our citizens across KZN and parts of Gauteng that were affected have chosen to address the issue. I think also we also cannot underestimate the degree to which large parts of our country beyond KZN and Gauteng were not pulled into this chaos. I think that is an indication of also the level of cohesion that does exist in our societies. I think a lot has been said about the fractures and the ways in which we're divided, but something also has to be said about the way in which our citizens are united on certain fronts. And I think that is something to take to heart, the degree to which the rest of the country was not drawn into this.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Thanks to all the panelists for all your various inputs and for all the participants for your comments. We're going to move on to our final item, which is the way forward and closing by Vish.
Okay, comrades, this was a great engagement today. And there were some important themes that came to the fore. First is the issue of structure and agency. So we've got to keep in mind that the structures of South African capitalism, the state, class structures, etc., have all engendered the conditions for deep crisis and a general crisis in South African society. But at the same time, there's also agency. There are social actors that express class relations and so on. And they also make choices and they shape our society. So structure and agency for me is very, very important for this conversation. And we've got to keep both aspects in perspective. I think the way we characterize the conjuncture is very, very important. We are living through, I would argue, the convergence of a failing class project led by the National Liberation Movement and the convergence of systemic crisis tendencies in our society. So in a sense, the more this class project has come to the fore, the more it has exacerbated or engendered systemic crisis tendencies, inequalities, failing healthcare system, deep food crisis, worsening climate crisis, etc. So South African capitalism and society is in a general crisis, comrades. And what's striking, and so this means that the more we have these conversations, and this has been happening for 4 years now, we've had signals of the crisis, we've had insights, and we've had moments, but it's becoming more and more clear. If you use the optic, if you use the lens of COVID-19, or if you use the lens of the July violence, South African society is definitely on a trajectory of general and deep-seated systemic crisis. And you have a failing national liberation project. Now, COVID-19, the conversation, as I said, underlined that we can't be hailing what we've experienced for almost 2 years now as some success story. It's clear that in comparative terms, the government chose a particular approach, which was in keeping with a right-wing version of science. It wanted to manage the requirements of capitalist accumulation, even in its regulatory regime and so on. And so we actually have a country that is really stumbling through this crisis, okay? I mean, you can talk about all the dimensions that have come to the fore, corruption, state failure, et cetera, et cetera. But again, the experience in the country in the moment of this pandemic is not one of hope, is not one of, well, we've done this together and that we're coming out of this stronger as a country. that we've overcome certain issues, etc. We've also seen the state wanting to do this in a very top-heavy way. It didn't build a partnership with society. It didn't democratize its own response or allow its response to be democratized from below. So this is another issue. So even if you have organized communities, you're dealing with the power elite and a particular approach to governance and rule, etc., that can also be, if you like, a serious problem. I think the other thing that has come out here very clearly is, how do we think about the July violence? I mean, how do we characterize this violence? I don't think anyone in this conversation has reduced this violence just to the insurrection, which is the formal narrative of the state and so on. We all recognize it's much more complex. There definitely was an instigation dynamic here. There was a kind of Zoomification agenda in all of this, but it was bigger than that. It fed into a context in which there's been deep discontent, deep alienation in our society, desperation in our society, and so it took on a life of its own as well. Not everything that's happened in the context of July was about race violence. Not everything was about African versus Indians or Indians versus Africans. It is a much more complex tapestry of what happened that came out in our conversation. In some places, yes, there were definitely racialized flashpoints, Phoenix being one of them, Pietermaritzburg being another, particularly in the northern suburbs. But it's not the case everywhere. And so it's a much more complicated picture in terms of how the violence unfolded. I think the other point that really comes out here again is the absence of the state. The state failed in this context. And so communities had to rise to kind of deal with this. And this went in reactionary directions, vigilantism in some instances. In other instances, it was about solidarities and communities working together, trying to deal with this crisis moment, trying to find ways forward and so on. What's also striking, though, is that in the aftermath of all of this, what's standing, what's really coming to the fore is the momentum in some communities to ensure just peace. And the dialogue processes that Roshan and many others are involved in, ACM and the Coalition of the Poor, etc., all are very, very important processes. And these are processes that are laying the basis for us to have the truth conversations, the difficult conversations, but also look at the underlying causes of what happened here. And within the limits of these processes, I think comrades have some very creative responses around how to rebuild differently, how to meet people's needs, and how to build community. And I think this is so inspiring, comrades, and thank you for what you are doing. I think the issue of the state response to the aftermath is something we really have to busy ourselves with. The instigators of this violence, including their role on social media or covertly, is something we really have to take seriously. We've got to put more pressure on the state around this issue. And maybe, while we might have micro level peace process, etc., there's room maybe nationally for a campaign for the against the SAPs to ensure there's justice, a just peace, and that prosecutions happen. Because if we don't take the step, comrades, we are going to be left with the situation of impunity. There are going to be political forces in our society that believe they can bring and unleash immense harm on this country, and they're going to get away with it. And so this is a very, very critical issue. And so the pressure on criminal justice system, on the police, on Parliament, on the Human Rights Commission, all of this is very important. And some of us have been working together around building some of this pressure. The question of social media looms large here. There's been analytic work done on social media network analysis, etc., that does show that there were social media, if you like, active campaigning to feed into the mobilization, into the frenzy, etc. And some of this evidence is there. But again, I mean, why hasn't the police acted on this? Is a very interesting question. Why hasn't the police arrested some of those people behind these accounts, etc., etc.? The vigilante stuff, again, in terms of the state response, and we've heard from Des, I mean, to reduce this entire moment of July to what happened in Phoenix is problematic. There must be justice in Phoenix. Racists, vigilantes must be dealt with the full might of the law, etc. And I think all those calls are being made very firmly. But we've got to understand these vigilantes also politically. And I think maybe the peace processes are also going to help us understand this better. And so there's a question mark here in our conversation. We haven't fully worked this out. It's something to think about more deeply. I mean, the vigilante issue, by the way, is not unique to the July moment. There's vigilante violence also in township communities. I mean, I had some exchanges on Facebook. I mean, because the state is failing, communities also take the law into their own hands when the police are not there to protect them in many township communities. And so they attack criminal elements, alleged rapists, etc., etc. So you have a very complicated situation on the ground in communities. And this kind of bleeds into a kind of confrontation with kind of warlord criminal elements, etc., etc. But it's something we got to really think about. And maybe as we go down this path with our dialogues, we grapple with this criminalized dynamic in our society. And then, of course, there's the rebuilding out of this process. And clearly, what's happening at a local level is key, but we have to connect this up with the national. This cannot be solved just in communities. This is a moment of the nation building crisis. So where is Parliament in all of this? Where is the political leadership of the society in all of this? And so this is a challenge for us to ensure that July is not just another moment that passes in the context of the general crisis of the society, the multiple crises that are hitting us. From our side as the COPAC team, we will take on board this conversation like we've been doing for the past 4 years. It will reflect in a document we're working on right now on the crisis of capitalism globally and in South Africa. It will reflect in how we think about democratizing and reclaiming a criminalized market democracy. And it'll reflect in the think piece, which is a synthesis of debate and discussion around towards a left party for South Africa. So we're going to be having a workshop at the end of the year around these documents, and we're going to put them out for public deliberation and debate and so on. Again, this is not claiming to have the answers, but it's very important to ensure that these critical conversations happen in society. If this lands somewhere where there is appeal, there is a connection with the zeitgeist, the spirit in our society right now, and people feel that they really need something more to secure the country. So we'll take that into a conference next year as well. So that's part of the way forward for us. I want to say a big thank you to everybody who made time. This was very much on the hoof. We felt that while we were preparing these documents, we couldn't, we had to pause. We had to reflect on what's been happening in the country and get input from comrades, from activists, and really shape the perspectives we're busy developing. So thank you to all of you for making your time. Many of our comrades couldn't make it today because it was a difficult time. Comrades are really busy right now, and we'll definitely ensure that in November we convene this at a time that's convenient for everyone. We probably might have it even in early December on a weekend. We normally meet on a weekend. So thank you to all of you, and thank you to Jane Cherry and Charles and Awande and everyone in the COPAC team for convening us. Comrades, yeah, with that, we'd like to conclude, unless there's any final observations anybody wants to make, comments, etc., before we disband. Anybody? Okay, well, that's it, comrades, and take care.